Hey everyone, and welcome back to Intro to American Studies. So this is the first week of our second unit, which will add gender and sexuality to our discussions of race and ethnicity from Unit 1. And most importantly, there is a new question for your weekly reflection. So each week you'll still be answering the original question of how the reading challenges or expands your understanding of America, but you will also answer a new question, which is, to what degree is the author's analysis intersectional, meaning that it incorporates multiple layers of discrimination, such as race, ethnicity, class, gender, sexuality, age, ability, and citizenship. So before you read the reading for this week, it's important that you watch Kimberly Crenshaw's video on the urgency of intersectionality. And it's about 20 minutes long, but you really only need to watch the first 12 minutes. And a warning that the last 6 minutes talk about police brutality against Black women. Crenshaw talks about this a little bit at the beginning of the video, but then goes into it in more detail towards the end. And if you're not up to watching more about that, understandably, then please just stop watching at the 12-minute mark and you won't miss anything crucial for the class. So for the lecture today, I'll briefly talk about what intersectionality is, but not in as much detail as Crenshaw does in her video. And then I'll talk about the Miles reading for this week. So there is a lot to cover this week, and it can be complicated and confusing. So please, if you have any questions, include them in your reflections or email me. So Kimberly Crenshaw is a lawyer and a legal scholar, and she coined the term intersectionality in 1989 to describe the double discrimination of racism and sexism faced by Black women. And she argued that in the context of the law, particularly workplace discrimination law, people were only allowed to sue a company based on racial discrimination or gender discrimination. And she noticed that many Black women's lawsuits were getting thrown out of court because they were discriminated against as Black women, not just as Black people or as women. And she used the metaphor of a traffic intersection to explain this. So on one road, you have racial discrimination, and on another road, you have gender discrimination. And Crenshaw argued that Black women are at the intersection of these two roads. And therefore, they experience, right, a particular type of discrimination at this intersection. So over the past 3 decades, scholars and activists have expanded the use of the term intersectionality to describe not only the overlap between race and gender, but also the numerous overlapping layers of discrimination based on many other categories of experience. And the basic idea of intersectionality is that we cannot accurately understand anyone's experience based on one layer of discrimination alone. So, for example, going back to the Muhammad reading, this was an excellent analysis of how Black people came to be seen as innately criminal and how this idea of Black criminality has been used to justify racist policies over the past century. However, a problem with Muhammad's book, arguably, is that it is not very intersectional. It does not deeply look at multiple layers of discrimination. It only really looks at one, race. So an intersectional critique of Muhammad's book is to ask about other layers of discrimination. So in particular, how about gender? How do Black people who are also women experience this idea of Black criminality differently? And actually, there is another scholar named Cheryl Hicks who did write a book based on Muhammad's work, but talking about the unique experiences of Black women and the criminal legal system in the progressive era. And she did find that there were differences, right, in how women were treated, particularly regarding sexuality. So, we might want to know, what about Black trans women who are known to be particularly violently targeted by the police? What about Black people who are gay or otherwise non-heterosexual? What about class? Black people who are working class or poor as opposed to middle class or wealthier? What about citizenship? Black people who are undocumented as opposed to U.S. citizens? What about ability? And by ability in this context, we don't really mean, whether you're good at sports or music or whatnot. We generally mean whether you have what are considered to be sort of neurotypical or able-bodied capabilities, or whether you have what are considered disabilities. All of these terms are, a little complex and problematic, but in general, ability has to do with the idea of disability. So we've seen a lot in the news lately about police interactions with Black people who have mental or physical disabilities, and how that adds another layer of discrimination that people face. So you could go on and on looking at how all these layers of discrimination shape how different Black people experience the criminal legal system differently, which shows how race in and of itself, is an insufficient category to explain all of the varieties of these experiences. And this applies far more broadly, right? Every single one of us could identify the many layers of discrimination that we face or do not face. So, I am white, I'm Jewish, I'm middle class, I'm queer, I'm a citizen, I'm able-bodied. So an intersectional analysis of my life would explore how I live at the intersection of all of these layers of discrimination, and no one layer defines me or my experience. So when you're answering this new question, what I want you to do is just to very briefly explain how the author does or does not consider multiple layers of discrimination. So for example, an answer to this question for the Muhammad reading, if I had assigned it then, might have been something like, Muhammad only really considers race, but he does not consider other layers of discrimination that could be relevant to Black people's experiences with the criminal legal system, such as gender or sexuality or class. So this could just be a sentence or two. And you want to make sure to look at what categories of discrimination the author is focusing on. So just because they casually mentioned at some point in the chapter that someone was a woman, that doesn't mean that they're considering gender, seriously. So you want to focus on what arguments is the author making, and are there big picture arguments taking into account multiple layers of discrimination or not. And it's okay if you're unsure about this, especially at first. We'll be practicing how to use this term and concept for the rest of the semester. So just give it a shot and we'll learn as we go. So on to the Miles reading. Two quick notes. So one is that it looks like a very long reading, When you open it, it might say, 50 something pages, but it's not true. It's really only about 28 pages and the text is pretty big. The rest is pictures and notes, but I included the pictures because I thought it could be cool to see some of what Miles is talking about visually, and we don't really have a lot of imagery in the class content to begin with, so don't be scared away by the page count. If you're interested in looking at the pictures, great. If not, skip them. This is really one of my favorite readings of the semester, and it was one of my students' favorite readings last semester as well. So I hope you enjoy it. The second is a note of caution. The reading does talk about sexual abuse, particularly of Black women, and the trauma of Black motherhood under racial oppression, including the death of Black children. So be warned that those topics may bring up particularly painful feelings for some of you, and as always, just pace yourself, take breaks if needed. So why did I pick this book? Well, I included this book for two reasons. So one is that it focuses on the Cherokee Nation, and at base, one of the fundamental issues with the idea of America, and therefore American studies, is the tendency to erase those who were here before European colonization, such as the Cherokee. So it's key background information to understand that before European settlement, this continent was inhabited by people of numerous tribal nations, and that over time, European settlers murdered most of these indigenous people and then forcibly removed those who remained from their native territories to the least desirable lands in the middle of the country. And by desirable, I generally just mean for agriculture. right? So the lands that white people didn't feel like they could make a lot of money off of, they would reserve those literally in what were called reservations for Native American peoples. So the first part of Miles's book takes place in the Cherokee Nation in the late 18th and early 19th century in its original location, which was in the southeast of the continent, near what is now known as Georgia. And the second part of her book takes place after the forcible removal of the Cherokee to the middle of the continent, near what is now known as Oklahoma. So that's the first reason. The second reason I chose this book is because it is such a great example of an intersectional approach to scholarship. Miles is not simply looking at the Cherokee experience, nor is she simply looking at the relationships between Cherokee people and Black people. She is looking at a particular Cherokee Black family in which the mother was enslaved. And therefore, she is asking how slavery and colonization and the gender and sexual relations of the family are all related. And before I even read the book, just knowing what it was about, Miles challenged my understanding of America because, honestly, I didn't know that there were Cherokee families that had held enslaved Black people in bondage, or that there were mixed Cherokee Black families. So I'm asking you all to read the preface because in it, Miles talks about how controversial it was for her to even ask these questions and write this book. And not just from white people wanting to keep the nation's sins under wraps, but from Black people and Cherokee people who wanted to keep their history separate so as not to complicate their movements for justice. And then after you read the preface, I'm asking you to read chapter 3 because it focuses on the complex gender and sexual dynamics of this family. So chapter 3 discusses 3 main topics. First, Miles talks about how the sexual assault of enslaved Black women was a fundamental component of the system of American slavery. Slaveholders wrote laws that decreed that slave status was inherited through the mother, and they then used their power to force Black women to reproduce so that they would create more enslaved people, and therefore more free labor to profit off of. Additionally, slaveholders could do what they wanted, what they individually wanted sexually with Black women, and these women had no recourse to the law to defend themselves. At the time, the law did protect white women to a degree from sexual assault. That's not to say that they were not vulnerable, but there were at least laws that they could try to turn to, right, for protection. Whereas for Black women, there was absolutely no law for them to turn to. And white women's children were not considered as enslaved. White women's children were considered free. So you see, again, these significant distinctions between white women and Black women. So just because they're both women, again, to Crenshaw's initial point, does not mean that they experience gender discrimination the same way. Secondly, Miles talks about the difference between the vulnerability of enslaved Black people under U.S. law versus under Cherokee Nation law. And she shows how kinship, particularly clan status, was the predominant political ordering system in the Cherokee Nation. And therefore, Doll, who is Shoe Boots' enslaved Black wife, was still vulnerable in the Cherokee Nation, but not because she was Black per se, but because she was not a member of a Cherokee clan. So again, race did not exist in the law in the same ways under the Cherokee Nation as it did under U.S. law. And Miles shows how in some circumstances, Black people could be adopted into the Cherokee Nation and into a particular Cherokee clan, and then, in theory at least, they were treated like any other Cherokee person, which was not the case under U.S. law, right? A Black person could be adopted by a white family, but that wouldn't make them not Black anymore. That wouldn't change their treatment under law, because under U.S. law, race was the predominant category, not clan affiliation. And just to note, it is important to recognize that The Cherokee Nation and all Native American nations are sovereign nations, meaning they do have their own legal system and structures and govern, right, their own territories in principle. There are lots of complications about that, but that is still the case to this day. So thirdly, Miles talks about the differences between the social, political, and economic rights of white women and Cherokee women. So while white women lived in a patriarchal society, meaning that men had more power, in which white men were legally in control of their families and held power over their wives and female relatives, Cherokee society is matrilineal, meaning that women were in control of their families and held power over their husbands and male relatives. And again, this is primarily, right, speaking to the time period that Miles is looking at in, the 19th and early 20th centuries, but there are absolutely still resonances of these distinctions today. So Miles explains all of these dynamics of race, tribe, gender, and sexuality, and then she asks, how does all of this apply to enslaved black wives in the Cherokee Nation? And she argues that Doll, who was Shubute's enslaved black wife, was still racially and sexually oppressed as an enslaved black woman in the Cherokee Nation, but the nature of her oppression was based not on the laws of slavery in the U.S., but rather on laws regarding clan status in the Cherokee Nation. And so she was vulnerable not necessarily as a black person, but as a person without clan status. And as a woman, she potentially had slightly more rights and autonomy than an enslaved woman in U.S. territory might have had, because of the privileged status of women in the Cherokee Nation. So using Crenshaw's terminology, Miles is revealing how Doll lived at this intersection of racial, gender, and sexual oppression with this added layer of Cherokee clan status. And Crenshaw's point and Miles's point is that we cannot even begin to understand Doll or those who had similar experiences as her without looking at how all of these layers of discrimination overlapped in her life. So her experience was not the same as black men at the time. It was not the same as white women at the time or Cherokee women at the time. And it was not the same as black women who were enslaved by white people at the time, right? So her experience had all these layers that have to be considered together in order to understand her experience. At the end of the chapter, Miles asks how we can understand the experiences of people like Doll who were not able to leave historical records from their own point of view. And she uses Toni Morrison's novel Beloved about the horrific experiences of motherhood under slavery in the US to help us imagine what Doll's experiences might have been like. So that's what's going on towards the end of the chapter. There's a bit of a shift in tone there. And there's so much more depth to this chapter, but I will stop there. I hope that you find this book as fascinating and illuminating as I do. And as usual, your reflections are due Sunday by midnight. And don't forget to answer that new question.